relationships are the number one cause of disappearances. Relationships, it goes back to something we talked about earlier about stranger danger versus, crimes being very personal. That you have a lot of disappearances that are what the kind called the man said. So guy allegedly wakes up one day and his wife's gone. Car's there, clothes are there, phone's there, purse is there, ID's there, everything. And it's not he who calls in the missing persons report. It's maybe someone in her biological family, a sister or something. Police show up at the door and the guy says, I don't know what to tell you. I woke up, she was gone. I don't know what to tell you. That's all. That's all I have to say. That's a very common type of disappearance, no matter where in the United States, rich or poor, black or white, doesn't matter. Very common type of ages don't matter. It's a very common type of disappearance. And that's why relationships are the number one cause of disappearances.
That's Ed Dentzel, the host of the Unfound podcast, a podcast that focuses exclusively on cases of missing persons. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Ed Dentzel is a bit of a Renaissance man. The son of a mother who is a music teacher and a father who is a football coach, Ed grew up in rural Pennsylvania outside of Pittsburgh and was trained as a classical pianist. He played baseball. He worked as an actor for more than 4 years on Star Trek: The Experience at the Las Vegas Hilton. He's been a writer and worked as a field consultant for 7-Eleven. He worked as an independent filmmaker and a stage manager for a Rat Pack show and a magic show. He had done an indie podcast on films. He wrote some novels, and in his spare time, he surfed the web for information about disappearances. Ed has said that he cannot even imagine how much time he spent looking into cases of people who had disappeared and chatting with other web sleuths online. In 2016, Ed was listening to a podcast on the disappearance of Maura Murray, a 21-year-old Massachusetts woman who went missing in New Hampshire in 2004. And just as he was trying to figure out what to do next in his life, Ed decided to make another jump that integrated his interests in disappearances and podcasting. Since then, Ed started a second podcast, Unfound. This podcast focuses exclusively on missing persons cases. Since then, Ed has published more than 450 episodes on more than 340 disappearances. Those disappearances include individual cases of people who have gone missing to ones where hundreds have, like the 2014 disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, which went missing over the ocean with 227 passengers and 12 crew members on board. Ed's work now involves researching and reporting on cases of missing persons and interviewing the loved ones of those who have not been found. A notable exception was an interview Ed did with a man suspected in the disappearance of 12-year-old Jonelle Matthews. Jonelle disappeared from her family's Greeley, Colorado home on a night in December of 1984. By the next year, President Ronald Reagan mentioned Jonelle's case at a news conference, and she became one of the first missing children whose picture was printed on a milk carton. On July 24th, 2019, Jonelle's remains were found by excavators installing a pipeline located about 15 miles southeast of her former home. Steve Pankey, a former Greeley resident, had been on the police radar since early in the case. Steve reached out to Ed and said he wanted to be interviewed about the case. That interview dropped on October 14th, 2019. By October 31st, 2022, Pankey had been tried twice and convicted of Jonelle's murder, and Ed was called by prosecutors who used some of the statements Pankey made to Ed during the interview against him at trial. Ed has featured many well-known cases, but much of his work is really about cases that others may not be aware of in many ways. When you listen to Ed, you'll realize that he knows more about missing persons cases, when, why, how, and what puts a person at risk than most law enforcement, and certainly more than you'll find in any federal database. Ed's goal is to increase awareness and educate the public more broadly about people who go missing and how. Ed hopes his work can contribute to fewer people disappearing and ensuring more answers can be found for those who are gone. Today, we're going to discuss Ed's journey to put a laser-like focus on researching and reporting on missing persons cases, how if you want to understand a disappearance, you have to get to know the victim, and how, despite the myths about stranger danger, relationships are the number one reason people go missing. In our upcoming episode in a few days, we'll discuss some of the other common reasons for disappearances, why law enforcement officers often find themselves unprepared to handle long-term missing persons cases, and what can be learned to improve training, and the importance of having empathy for people going through experiences we cannot imagine. Hey, Ed, I just wanted to thank you for coming on. Several of my friends have been longtime fans of your podcast, and this year, part of what I've been focusing on are cases of missing persons and disappearances, marginalized victims and underrepresented. So a lot of them have been pointing toward you, but I am a classic knucklehead, so you have to tell me 7 times before I actually do it. And then increasingly, my friends who are podcasters started telling me, you really got to check this out as they saw my interest. So I'm glad that we were able to connect, and I'm really excited to have you on. So thanks. I just wanted to start with that.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Yeah. I one of the things that sort of I think fascinates me about you, and I have this habit of wanting to just sort of dive into a topic and an interview, but really your life fascinates me. There are so many different things.
So you're the one, Jason.
I'm the one person fascinated by you. I don't think so. I don't think so. But I mean, you've done so many different things. When you were 5, you started playing piano. You continued to do that. You were an athlete in school. You work for 7-Eleven. You were an actor on Star Trek. You were a stage manager, and a bloody good podcaster, researcher, and reporter on missing persons cases now. And I'm just curious about that journey. And, I think a lot of times, I was just thinking to myself recently, we're in high school and they're like, you need a pass to go to the bathroom. And now you've graduated from high school, and the next day you need to know what you want to do with the rest of your life. Yeah. And, I was just thinking about that context of those of us who are comfortable with exploring and finding different things and have winding paths. And just looking at your biography, I was like, wow, I would have never guessed at the beginning this would have ended in being a reporter and a researcher doing missing persons cases.
Yep, I'm full of surprises.
So how'd you end up on this journey?
Well, I have to admit that I don't ever remember, I'm 54. I grew up in the 80s. I don't ever remember thinking, I'm going to do this when I grow up. I don't ever remember thinking that, maybe because my parents had me involved in so many different activities. Of course, from my mother's side, got the music and arts. And from my dad's side, I got the sports and competitiveness and everything. And I did well in high school in my, classes. I didn't do so well in college, but for other reasons. So I think it's that. I think it's just because I really never said, I'm going to be an astronaut. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
for cancer. I don't ever, in fact, I went to college, and that was probably part of the reason I didn't do so well, is there was no real plan.
And your parents didn't put that pressure on you to kind of like figure out what it
No,
was.
I would say that in retrospect, my parents picked my college curriculum for me. And then that's why I didn't do so well in it when I first started there and switched.
Mm-hmm.
Switch classes, switch degrees, that, and then that kind of just continued after I got out of college. Still wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but then I surely figured out at some point I don't want to be in Pennsylvania anymore. And that's when I went to Las Vegas, and of course, Las Vegas, you can do a lot of different things. More than maybe than any other city in the United States.
Why'd you pick Vegas? Because you were in rural
I already had a
Pennsylvania?
friend who lived there, a friend who grew up with me, a very, very good friend of mine, still one of my best friends, moved there with his girlfriend in 96. And then they had a roommate moving out in 98. And I found out about it and said, I'll take that spot. So I moved out there and moved in with them in May of 98.
Hmm. And while you were in Vegas, what are some of the things that you did while you were there?
Well, started out as working for 7-Eleven, which was a horrible job. Once again, trying to go in that, climb the corporate ladder path. And after about 10 months of that, I figured out, what, I'm not that guy. And it wasn't just about that particular company or that particular genre of job in the economy or anything else. It's just, I'm not that guy. And so I just quit. Not even 2 weeks notice. I just quit on the spot. And I ended up getting into writing, and I was an office manager for a film festival. And then eventually that led to me working at Star Trek. And then from there, and then he did some independent filmmaking. And from that, I ended up being a stage manager. It just kind of went one thing to the next from there. But still, those were not things that I knew were ever going to be careers for me. Some people do make them. Of course, Star Trek closed in the attraction closed in 2008, but there are people who are stage managers for shows in Vegas their entire lives. That just
Right.
wasn't, I liked it, but I just couldn't see me doing that forever.
Yeah, because I think of something like the Star Trek The Experience, which was the live show. That was a live show, right? The live show. Yeah. Yeah. Um, there are people who probably spend, like their young lives trying to get a spot like that, doing drama, smaller acting parts. And,
Mhm.
was it just sort of like, or these things sort of like a whim for you? I'm going to go try this, and you
Yes,
feel
the
like
Star Trek thing
comfortable.
it was a whim.
Yeah.
It absolutely was. What happened was, at that point, in the beginning of 2000, I was working as a production assistant on a variety of TV shows and movies in Vegas, kind of going gig to gig, as they say. And working on that, maybe 2 to 3 months, I found out that the people who are in front of the camera get treated a lot better than people who are behind the camera.
Mm.
And it just so happened, I mean, this is back when newspapers were still read, the actual paper newspapers.
Yeah, the Dead Tree. Love
Yeah,
'em.
in the Review Journal, in the Help Wanted section, there was an ad for auditions for Star Trek: The Experience. That's how it happened. I was going through the want ads looking for something new to do, and I saw that ad, and I said, "Well, I did drama club in high school. I can do this."
Might as well give it a whirl.
I practiced a monologue, and I know I'm a Star Trek fan anyway, and I went in there and got a full-time position there. Just it was a whim, just didn't even know it was in there. It was in the Help Wanted section of the
Oh,
Las Vegas Review Journal. Must
so,
have been in April of 2000.
so you were already a Star Trek fan. So you were sort of like As Julia says about herself, Julia Cowley from the Consult, retired FBI profiler, she says about herself that people at the BAU, once she got there, because she was a true crime fan, they said she was the groupie who joined the band. So that was
Right.
kind of
I
you
guess
then.
I was kind of a groupie that joined the band, although there were people there who were even bigger fans and obsessed with it than I am or was. And then there were many people who worked there who were performers, didn't know the first thing about Star Trek.
And you did that for like 4.5
Four and a
years.
half years, yes.
Okay. And then how did you end up leaving Vegas? Where'd you end up after that?
I ended up where I am now here on the Gulf Coast of Florida. That was 2011. Just thought I had worn out my time there.
Hmm.
And I have a brother, Brian, who lives in this area. And I thought, I think I need a change of scenery. The thing about Las Vegas is it's a big city, but it's a small city. In that, it's just Vegas. It's not like LA where you go from one city to another city to another city, or maybe on the East Coast, you go one city to the next city. It's Las Vegas or desert. There's nothing in between. And so it's a very small town like that. And I think at some point I just felt a little limited
Claustrophobic.
or bored or something. I know you were bored in Las Vegas. I'm not a drinker. I'm not a gambler or anything like that. So, like I said, I just got up one day and said, maybe I think I need to go somewhere else.
So you went to Florida with like no real sort of plan or job or
No plan.
yeah.
No, I
How,
was, how old would I have been? 41 at the
okay.
time. So got the U-Haul, towed the car behind, came down here, lived in Madeira Beach first, which is one of the places that got hit the hardest by Hurricane Helene back at the beginning of beginning of October, end of September, beginning of October of this year. Where I used to live was like ground zero, one of the worst places to be. Where I used to, I don't live there now, but where I first moved on 140th Street in Madeira Beach, that was one of the worst places.
Hey, you've got no plan.
Yeah.
Where does it go from there? And by the way, just so you know, Ed, this is my dream. Like I am just like this. I'm like,
Oh, be careful what you ask.
everything I do is on a whim. Trust me.
I came down here thinking I'm going to come down here. I'm going to play some disc golf because that's my sport. And I'm going to do a lot of writing. And both of those things happened, but really did not have a lot of success I wrote a lot, but couldn't get a literary agent, went to pitch some stories, books and things. Really had no success really doing that between 2011 and 2015 into 2016. Fortunately for me, I don't have any kids. I've never been married. I don't have any pets. So I don't have a lot of expenses. So I had saved up money living in Las Vegas. So I could kind of cautiously live with that, watching my, cents, dollars and cents, and managed to do that. But, I was never, I don't want anybody to think that I was just lounging back and everything. Every day was work. Even though I technically have a job, I was still doing stuff every day, trying to make something of myself.
Was it Florida where you started to get interested in disappearances and
No, I'd started way back
websites
in
or that?
Pennsylvania when I was like 7 years old.
That's fascinating.
70s, yeah.
So what
Right.
was it in the 1970s? So that's even before kids were showing up on milk cartons
Yes, it
or
was.
what do you think
It
that
was
was?
the show for me was In Search Of
Mm.
with Leonard Nimoy.
Leonard Nimoy, yeah.
Right, and just coincidentally Star Trek. How about that?
Yes, right.
And you look back at it now, and that is a very cheesy show. And obviously there was a lot of artistic license being taken in that show, if not outright lying. But at a 7-year-old in Gilpin Township, Pennsylvania, out in the country hills, rolling hills of Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania, I was like, man, there is this world out there where this stuff is going on. That's crazy. And it kind of caught my fancy, caught my attention. Of course, some of those episodes of that show were disappearances like Amelia Earhart. And then there was stuff like UFOs and things, a lot of things that I don't believe in today. But that's what got me started. Like there's this big world out there where mysteries, real mysteries are happening.
Yeah.
Well, not crossword puzzles in the paper, not those puzzles that you got used to getting that magazine games. No, there are real mysteries happening in real life.
Yeah, and I remember they did things like DB Cooper,
Yeah,
the Mary Celeste they did.
that's right.
I think
The
did they
Nazca lines.
Yes, that's right.
They
That's right.
did the Bimini Road. All that stuff. Maybe is the Earth hollow or aliens living inside the Earth?
Good old Loch Ness Monster, I remember.
Yeah, and there's that guy from the Victorian era that allegedly had lived forever and stuff like that. Yeah,
Roanoke Colony too. I'm pretty sure that's where I first heard of that.
Probably in there too, right? Yeah.
The so that must have been really sort of like enthralling and interesting at the time. Were there other shows that caught your attention after that?
That's the one that sticks out.
Yeah.
And then going into the 1980s, then we started with Cops. And my friend's father, they're brothers, they're best friends of mine. They're all brothers, but they're all my best friends. But their father was a part-time cop, and so he had one of those scanners in their house.
Mm-hmm.
And I love to go over there and listen to hear what's going on out there, in the immediate area, people getting pulled over, and that was always fascinating to me, even though I could have never been a police officer.
So it sounds like you always had sort of like a natural curiosity.
Yeah, like I said, mysteries and intriguing topics and trying to solve things. Yeah.
Yeah. And you were adopted, right? And when you were younger.
Yep. That's right. I was.
Yeah.
I was born on August 1st, 1970. I was immediately given up for adoption. I was adopted a month later. I was raised as an only child. So when I talk about my brother Brian or my sister Diane, my brother Michael, those are actually my biological siblings who I didn't meet until 1994.
1994. Did you know you were adopted when you were young?
I always knew that. I didn't know until 1994 that I had siblings.
Yeah, part of the reason why I asked was one of the things in the work that I've done in mental health, that one of the things I've noticed about a lot of, their complications and they're actually positive bright sides to being adopted. But I've noticed among a lot of my clients over the years who are adopted, this natural curiosity. And sometimes I attribute it to, maybe wanting to know more about their birth families or inevitably having questions about everything from why they were given up to what their families are really like. And I remember I was talking to a young person who was adopted, and he said, well, like one thing, yeah, you do wonder about all these things. His parents in South Korea had given him up to Americans when he was a baby. And he said, you do wonder about a lot of things, but he's like, he was saying it's sort of deeper than that, because as a kid, you're questioning things about the world and wondering about the world in ways that most people don't until they're much older, right? That they're bigger questions for you that young people don't normally tackle. I wonder whether some of that plays a role in it, that you guys are searching.
Could be being that I was raised an only child, that I had to make my own fun. And living out, like I said, I wasn't certainly not out in the middle of nowhere, but it was a place where you could ride your dirt bikes or your three-wheelers right on the country roads, even though they were paved, you could get away with doing that. And so I did have a dirt bike, and I would just, my parents wouldn't know where I was for hours, so I guess I am creating was creating my own adventures back then. Yes. Just like Tom Sawyer.
Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer, Mark Twain.
Right.
So for you, eventually you get to the point where I know you have mentioned in interviews that one of the real sort of like formative points for your podcast was listening to a podcast about the disappearance in 2004 of Maura Murray.
That's right. I was would have been listening to that probably 2015. Yeah.
Okay, so a little bit, well, significantly after she disappeared, but as true crime is becoming sort of bigger and bigger, what were your thoughts when you were listening to that podcast?
First of all, you have to remember something that it still, I think, amazes everybody. And I'm not even sure when I say it, people believe me. But when I got into podcasting in 2016, I didn't even know that true crime podcasting was like this huge thing.
Mm.
So when I was listening to the Maura Murray podcast in 2015, I don't think I had ever even heard of the podcast Serial, even though that's probably the best well-known true crime podcast of all time. And to this day, I've never listened to an episode of it. So when I was listening to the Maura Murray podcast, I thought that this was just some sort of one-off type of thing. I didn't realize there were like 1,000 other true crime podcasts out there. It just shows you how clueless I was. But I think that's also reflected in why Unfound is maybe a little different than most true crime podcasts, because I wasn't being guided by what anybody else was doing because I didn't know they even existed.
You weren't using a template.
I'd surely known about her disappearance before the podcast came out, but I started listening to it. Yeah. I don't think I listened to all the episodes eventually, but yeah, I listened to it. Yeah.
Yeah. And was that part of the inspiration for you?
No, I would not say that podcast was the inspiration for me. No, the inspiration was later in 2016. I ended up becoming friends. We never actually ever did meet in person, with a woman who was also listening to the podcast, the Maura Murray podcast, and she and I would just end up happening to always talk back and forth about it, even though it's
online.
Like in a comment section on YouTube, or I don't remember where.
Mm-hmm.
And I just came up one day and said to her, we should do a podcast. It was like March or April of 2016. And she said, yeah, let's do that. And we did about 5 episodes and it kind of just fell apart. I'm not here to point fingers or anything. I think that just didn't work out, because I had a lot of time. She didn't have a lot of time. I had a background in speaking and everything, and she didn't. A lot of things. Once again, not blaming her.
Right.
That's totally fine. I get it. But it just wasn't going. And then she just said one day, I don't want to do this anymore. And it was a crushing blow to me. And the funny part about it is the last disappearance. We only did like 5 or 6 episodes. The last episode we did was on Jody Huisentrude.
Oh, which comes back around in this entire story.
Julia. And then, of course, Caroline
Lowe. Yeah, the advocate for the case. Yeah.
So and that's how I first, by the way, that's how I first met Caroline, was through that podcast, not through Unfound.
Yeah. And she disappeared. It was Mason City, Iowa in, 1995, right? And she was a television anchor who just, as I recall, one morning was running a little late to work, went out into the apartment parking lot and was never seen, right? Again.
That's right. So I did that podcast, and when it was a crushing blow, because I thought we were doing pretty well, even though, like I said, there were problems, the people were listening to it. And so, as soon as we were done, as soon as we decided this isn't going to go any further, I said, I'm going to do my own podcast, and I'm going to make a podcast. I'm going to do it by myself, so I don't have to, I'll be honest, share time with anybody. As Jack Black said in School of Rock, I got vision up the butt, so no power plays.
At least you're self-aware, Ed. At least you're self-aware.
Yeah. I had a vision. And so I put that, vision into action starting in September of 2016.
So for you, that's the beginning of Unfound.
That's right.
What were you thinking in the beginning when you first started with Unfound? What direction you were going to take it in? You
Uh,
knew missing.
I didn't really think I didn't know how far it was going to go. In fact, to just show you how I wasn't really confident about how long it was going to be able to go, is because I used copywritten music for it, which you're not supposed to
Supposed to
do.
do, right?
And then the original logo that I had was not even original. It was just like ripped off of like Google Images or something like that. And and kind of messed around with it a little bit. And that ended up being, that was what the song I ended up keeping in like till the end of 2017. The logo got changed, I think, maybe the spring of the next year of 2017. But I started out with copyright music, all the signs that I just didn't know how long this was going to last.
Right. So and now we are, let's see, 2016. We're 8 years,
Over 8 years in, 465 episodes,
465 episodes. How many total cases?
like about 355.
355 total cases. And then when you say case, you're not referring to individuals, because I know
No,
you've
no,
done
no, no.
things like,
That disappearance, however many people are involved.
wow, wow. Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, and I've thought about this a lot this year, like my first experience, I think I've interviewed probably 10 people this year who have had loved ones go missing. And every time I have one of them on, not far from the back of my mind is my senior year of high school. And then the senior year of high school, I was working for a student newspaper. And so just rewinding a little bit. So, 4 years before, I had moved from Georgia to Northern Virginia in my freshman year of high school, which is perhaps the worst time to to move. And there was this kid, his name was Winford Martin. We were both 14 at the time. He was in my class. He was very nice to me, very gregarious, just warm and friendly and memorable. One of the handful of people who are just really memorable in terms of welcoming me with open arms. And then in my senior year, during our winter break, Winford disappeared. And
Wow.
I won't forget, it was January 15th of our senior year, so 1994. He was found out frozen in a rural field, shot in the back of the head with his cousin. And this is like the leafy Northern Virginia suburbs where things like this are not supposed to happen, and that's why you moved there. And one of the things that I think probably propelled me into going into journalism was because if you're a smart reporter, any reporter worth your salt, and there is a big event that happens related to a high school, first place you call is the student newspaper. And the Washington Post reporter at the time called the student newspaper. I was also covering the story. I was able to help her find, loved ones and other people who could help with the story. But one of the things I noticed about her stories is it gave family members, it gave his friends at our school, his girlfriend, an opportunity in my mind to sing his song, tell his story. It kept the pressure on local authorities to continue to, because Winford's black and we're in like a 95% white Northern Virginia community. It kept the pressure on the local authorities to pursue the case. And it really had this healing power. It knocked away a bunch of horrible rumors that were going on. I always tell people it felt like when we found out the news, it felt like, the world had been knocked off of its axis. And I saw the journalism actually bring order and peace and healing And that was like a profound, I think, a profound moment for me. And it just comes up every time in my mind this year as I do these interviews. And I was thinking about it as I was listening to your podcast in the context of that notion, that idea. You're educating people, you're building awareness about cases, but you're also, through your interviews, giving people a voice. And to me, I find that part unbelievably powerful, because so many true crime podcasts, and there are plenty that don't have loved ones of victims on, but they do their research. They might talk to family members. So I'm not meaning to denigrate those, but so many, I sort of feel like, rip it from the headlines and don't give the ones most centrally impacted a voice. And I found that powerful about your approach.
I appreciate that. And you should know, although I don't think this has ever come up on a public interview on my podcast, but behind the scenes, I will tell you that families hate it when their loved one's disappearance gets covered by somebody and they're not even consulted. They hate it.
Yeah. I can see why. I mean, even something as simple as just knowing it's coming, right? But also things like just simple facts, getting those right.
Yep.
Or even like minimizing, which I think is like an important part to any journalism, minimizing harm. If a fact isn't necessary for the truth, or if it's uncorroborated, it might be flashy or it might add color, but there's no reason to put it in. And if you don't reach out to people who are knowledgeable, there's no way to protect against that.
Right.
So why'd you decide to take that approach? Were you seeking to differentiate it, or did you just sort of feel like that was the natural, normal, right way to do it?
I think it goes back to the first podcast I did with the co-host, in that she had actually reached out to a mother of a missing girl, and I found that fascinating. It was not something maybe that I'd ever considered before, and that became one of the bases for Unfound. Just let that person talk. I don't have to talk. Why don't we just let that person talk? Now, they don't get to say everything they want, because we're going to have to avoid defamation and everything. But it's going to be in a structured way, and they're going to prove everything before we go, through it. That just seemed like the best way to do it, like I said, when I was thinking about it.
Yeah.
In the summer of 2016.
I was thinking about another thing about your podcast that sticks out to me. In covering a lot of these cases or researching them, one of the things that I've noticed is, if you're searching for information on missing persons cases, there are not a lot of really good central resources. I recently did a interview with a woman in Alaska who does work with Indigenous people, and we were talking about the difference between what the federal database says in terms of the number of missing people and what they've collected and the level of detail. This August, I went out to Minnesota to visit an Ojibwe reservation in Mille Lacs, the Mille Lacs band of the Ojibwe in north central Minnesota. And I was looking at NamUs, which is the National Missing and Unidentified Database run by the Department of Justice. And there were 14 natives in Minnesota that were listed as missing. And when I went to the grocery store there and I looked on the corkboard, there were 21 flyers just for that reservation. And it was wild to me. It was wild to me that that there isn't an easy way to really get your head around the number of people who are missing. Do we know how many missing people there are, or do we have an idea of how many?
100,000 in the United States.
Wow. That's it's wild to me to think that there are that many missing people. How do you go about deciding what cases you're going to cover?
I know this is going to sound very existential, but I really don't pick the cases. The cases pick me.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that is, we're always reaching out to families, and they're the ones who choose to get back to us.
Hmm.
So if they get back to us, we talk to them. That's how they end up on the podcast. I mean, of course, I'm not forcing people to be interviewed. So they choose whether they want to be on the podcast. That's, it's the guest chooses what the catalog of Unfound, total repertoire of cases are. I do not.
Hmm. Do you find people now that the podcast has been around for a while and you built a reputation who are reaching out to you on their own?
Oh, sure. Yeah, sure. There are people who have found out about it. And, you find out these missing persons families, a lot of them know each other.
Mm.
So, word spreads around, hey, this guy is doing good work, does a very structured interview. There's no sensationalism. He's not going to get us all in trouble and we end up in court saying stuff we shouldn't be saying. That gets around. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. And I certainly have had that same experience that, one good interview with somebody, little do you know, they know a bunch of other people, and then all of a sudden, right, it's this sort of like silent network of people who have lost their loved ones that exists and operates in the background. And I mean, it's a club nobody wants to be invited to, but
Nope.
yeah, one thing about it is there are some pretty amazing people in the background who quietly support each other. And I've been impressed by that, I think. One of the things that we had said when we were offline, or that I had said to you, is it is amazing I think the educational power of your podcast and the repository of information that you have about disappearances. And I remember going back to growing up in the 80s and the stranger danger campaigns that existed then. And I've always felt like one of the really dangerous things that came out of that, was the focus on worrying about, the guy in the trench coat or the guy driving the ice cream truck who you don't know, or that stranger who says hi to you. And I remember being sort of like flabbergasted as I got to high school and I began to realize things like, oh, most sexual assault for kids is likely to be somebody who knows you or your family, and that, a lot of violence against women is by husbands, boyfriends, or other people who are close to them. And I'm just curious about like some of those myths and misconceptions that we hold, and what are the realities when it comes to disappearances.
Well, regarding stranger danger, I mean, certainly it's something that everybody should know. I mean, adults get abducted and killed by strangers too. It's something, but the FBI stats will tell you, most crime is personal. People who know each other. We think that it's I think especially with the internet, with YouTube, for example, you see all these videos, people just pumping their car and somebody comes up and shoots them and carjacks them or something. Everybody starts thinking, well, that's the way the world is. Well, that's part of the world, but that's not a majority of crimes. And so here you have to think about it this way. Stranger danger. I mean, what are they going to say? Hey, we have to watch out for parents out there. You have to think of it that way.
Yeah.
If children go missing or children are harmed, odds are it's the parents or somebody friends of the parents or the new boyfriend who's actually a pedophile, people like that. You don't think, that's not a very very good marketing campaign. Nobody wants to hear about how parents harm their children. So it's easier just to talk about stranger danger.
Well, it's interesting you say that. Like, and people may not want to hear about it, but I can remember in high school realizing, oh yeah, like the biggest threats are from inside your house. And mainly where this came from is very fascinating to me. It was like I it's always been easy, I think, for my friends to talk to me. So a lot of my friends would end up telling me um, their stories of like abuse or things that were going on inside their households that they didn't want to know about or didn't want people to know about. And one of the great things, and I mean, it was horrible, but great things about that for me, I think, is in later life, or even in one instance in high school myself, I started to have an eagle eye on adults and parents and uncles and other people who had like what I sort of consider privileged access to children. Um, and I think knowing about that, like I can think in at least one instance in my life, God bless my mom, we had a neighbor's kid who came over and mentioned to my brother and I something about abuse. And we told our mom. My mom called the father who didn't live with the kids then, and they were out that day. And I think awareness about it being a possibility, you know, and it comes back down to your podcast, like understanding these realities actually probably give you an opportunity to be a better citizen on some levels and certainly safer yourself.
Sure. I mean, certainly it's opened my eyes over the last 8 years. For example, my opinion on law enforcement has certainly dropped, just as an example. It's certainly opened my eyes to things that you think are so, but aren't.
Like what do you mean by that? Like things that you think are so but aren't?
Go with the police. Families put too much faith in them. They think that, well, the police will know what to do regarding this disappearance. And you listen to enough Unfound episodes, you'll find out, you know what? No matter if it's California, Florida, New York, or wherever, a lot of times they don't know. They don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And they don't take it seriously. And they are dismissive. And they, things that they shouldn't be. And as I continue to say, you get to a disappearance that lasts like more than a week, and police probably at that point are all tapped out of ideas.
Do you think that part of it is, and if someone's murdered, and you likely have a body, don't always have a body, but you likely have a body. You have a crime scene, to process it, to look for evidence. But when someone disappears, I mean, you have sort of faint clues. You aren't trained for it, right?
Right?
When these
No
guys go to
training.
school, they get trained, how to control a crime scene, how to collect evidence, how to do forensic stuff that they may never actually do in their entire careers.
Yep.
You learn to shoot a gun, but you don't learn what to do in a disappearance. And I'm just thinking back to earlier this year when I interviewed Julie Murray about her little sister Maura, or Bruce
Yep.
Maitland.
I know Julie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
His daughter, his 17-year-old daughter, disappeared that same year as Maura, but in Vermont. In both of those cases, and most of the cases where I've talked to people, with maybe one exception where the father himself was law enforcement, which caused probably a different kind of reaction. Um, you know, the police either made huge mistakes, were baffled. But Julie talks about how the family in the beginning just trusted law enforcement, and
Yep.
that if they had it over again, they would have put more pressure on them. They would have done things a lot differently. Where do you think law enforcement tends to drop the ball in the beginning of these kinds of cases?
They don't. They don't know what they're looking at when they see it. When you are an expert at something. For example, if you go to a doctor and you start telling the doctor, "Here's what's going on, doc. I got this problem. Here's what's, I have this symptom, that symptom. The doctor might not be able to absolutely narrow it down to the very, very one thing and be correct. Probably can get it down to make maybe 3 to 5 different possibilities, maybe just 3. With police, they're not able to do that. Aren't able to do that because they don't have the training and they don't have enough experience with long-term disappearances to learn either. There's no education, so there's no experience, so there's no knowledge. And so you have to know it. So when you show up at a missing person, somebody calls in, hey, my daughter is missing. And a police officer goes out there to fill out the report. As the officer's filling out the questionnaire, whatever the questions are, the little slots on the report, the police officer should be able to start telling himself, all right, she's saying this. This is probably what's going on. Okay? They can't do that. They're not able to do that. So you got to know it when you see it. You have to be like the doctor. When you hear something, you need to know something. Police can't do that.
Do you think it's like, I'm kind of just thinking to myself that, little stuff, for example, just thinking about it from the perspective of somebody who calls their grandmother every day, doesn't call their grandmother for 2 days, red flag, right? Like,
yeah,
being able to look at somebody's pattern of life and their normal behaviors and see the aberrations, that kind of stuff does not really sort of like suit itself very easily to a form, if that makes sense. It requires you sort of like digging a little bit deeper. And I wonder also because so many missing persons cases are initially things like runaways or short-term missing cases that law enforcement has become very desensitized to it because 9 out of 10 times or 19 out of 20 times,
right,
there and so you end up not really asking the questions that you might actually know might be helpful or something
right.
along those lines.
They get behind this. Even a disappearance. This is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Even though this disappearance has not been featured on my podcast, Jennifer Kesse. Are you familiar with her disappearance? Yeah. All right. So Jennifer Kesse was educated young woman. She was engaged. She was living in her own place. She was working her way up the corporate ladder in the real estate company, whatever it was that she was working in. And when she didn't show up for work, her parents show up, find out, the police call her something, and they travel over there and they're looking at her place, which is, and her car is not there either. Orlando police detective or investigator, police officer shows up. What does the officer say to the family? What do these? She's probably off with some guy. She'll be back soon. Now, does Jennifer Kesse to you sound like a woman who would just go off with some guy and not go to work and everything?
Well, she had a steady boyfriend. They had just come back from a vacation. She was very responsible and always showed up at work, at least according to her family.
That's right. And, they find out, the police show up, they tell them about her, and then that's the response. They're not listening. Police weren't listening. Once again, you have to know it when you see it. You should know no woman like Jennifer Kesse is going to run off and do something like that. Maybe a young woman who has a drug addiction or is into prostitution or has bad taste in men or something might do that. But not Jennifer Kesse, not someone in her demographic.
Right.
Not, and that's why I say disappearances are about people, not about circumstances. If you want to understand a disappearance, get to know the person, because we all fall into our lifestyles, our choices, where we live and everything. We all fall into certain categories of the reasons that we would go missing.
Oh, that's interesting.
And Jennifer Kesse does not, in the way she chose to live her life, did not fall into a category which she would run off with some guy and not show up for work.
So you think in like these missing persons cases, some really quick victimology is very important.
Yes.
To figuring it out. It's an interesting point, because I even think of, take somebody in a demographic that I presume, right, is more likely to go missing, somebody who's less educated, somebody who, let's say, has a drug problem. You can still wrap your head around the patterns of their life, right? Like, I might call my drug dealer every day. I might X, Y, or Z. But if you're looking at that victimology and then comparing it to what you're seeing, that will give you a pretty deep clue. And, the example that you gave with the Jennifer Kessie case is, one of the real criticisms is they missed a real opportunity to canvas that day. And by missing that opportunity to canvas, they didn't end up interviewing a bunch of workers who had been working in the apartment complex, and those guys were gone by the end of the week. So there are times where, if you miss those clues early on, you completely lose the opportunities to collect information.
Certainly, that should have been done. That I will be honest, that's not what I think happened to her. But that still should have been done. And because why are they going to question those landscape workers, whoever they were, in the apartment complex when they thought she ran off with some guy?
Yeah, and to your point, whether it was them or not, the fact that you can't rule them out years later means resources still get pointed in that direction,
right?
And that takes away from other opportunities. Hey, what are the other things that you see in terms of like patterns among people who are more likely to disappear? I know you mentioned we should look at victimology, and you mentioned, Jennifer being educated. What kinds of patterns do you see?
Relationships are the number one cause of disappearances. Relationships, it goes back to something we talked about earlier about stranger danger versus, crimes being very personal. That you have a lot of disappearances that are what the kind called the man said. So guy allegedly wakes up one day and his wife's gone. Car's there, clothes are there, phone's there, purse is there, ID's there, everything. And it's not he who calls in the missing persons report. It's maybe someone in her biological family, a sister or something. Police show up at the door, and the guy says, "I don't know what to tell you. I woke up, she was gone. I don't know what to tell you. That's all. That's all I have to say." That's a very common type of disappearance, no matter where in the United States, rich or poor, black or white, doesn't matter. Very common type of ages don't matter. It's a very common type of disappearance. And that's why relationships are the number one cause of disappearances.
And in that example that you're giving, is that the reaction? Would that be a flag if you were sitting in the investigator's shoes, which maybe you should be? If you were sitting in the investigator's shoes, would that instantly be a flag, that flat response?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Men who love their wives don't act like that. And even more so, you find when you get to know these guys, usually they are control freaks and they were running their their wives' lives, and they don't know where their wife is. They don't know where their girlfriend is, even though they're controlling. You find out they're controlling everything that they do.
Yep. It's kind of like your stalker not knowing where you are.
That's right.
It's not really a believable thing.
Right. You'd be surprised how many police just go along with these guys. You'd be, my impression, you'd be surprised how many times they just, "Oh, really, Mr. Smith? Thank you for telling us that."
We're going to pause there and pick back up where we left off in a few days in the next episode. I hope you all can join us. For the time being, if you want to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. See you guys all again in a few days.